come to order. Welcome to the Florida Veterans for Common Sense meeting. So with no further ado, I'll introduce our speaker. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jeff Orenstein, and he has a Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and then he was a full professor at Kent State University in political science. And he has a resume that's about 4 pages long, which I'm not going to read to you, but to summarize, he's written several books, about 6 or 7 books. He's written lots of magazine articles, and one thing that really caught my attention is the fact that he published and edited a magazine. And so he's also involved with many local civic organizations and government organizations like the planning department, et cetera. So he should be able to tell us some hints on how we can persuade our fellow veterans, or fellow citizens actually, to reject this MAGA movement that we're all dealing with this election year, and maybe give us some ideas so that we can move forward more effectively. So Jeff, the floor is yours, sir.
First of all, I appreciate being here. My name is Jeff Orenstein. I am the chairman of the board of a new organization, about a year old, called First Responders for Democracy. We formed in 2023. We are a Florida nonprofit. We became a 501c3 in May of 23, which is, I guess, a record of doing it that fast, but we have a great lawyer. And we are governed by a board of directors, one of which is here. This is my wife, Virginia. You met Jenny. She is our treasurer and a CPA, and she's kind of our voice on political economy and how economics and government economic policy affects our democracy. So our mission is to assist and support civic literacy, and I'm going to tell you tonight what I mean by civic literacy, for citizens, educators, and organizations like this by providing objective government, economic, and civic information, because we do a lot of research and we have a lot of people with a lot of background in this area, and to promote the critical thinking skills needed for a democratic society. We're doing things like media awareness, and how to deal with deep fakes and things like that. Our website, and I would appreciate if you take a look at it, is www.savingdemocracyusa.com. That's savingdemocracyusa.com. And our Facebook page is facebook.com/First Responders for Democracy. Tonight I want to talk to you about civic literacy and what it is, and some of what we can all do to kind of move our political system and nudge it in a good direction. Politics and public sector institutions constitute our common civic space. They're a huge and unavoidable part of our lives. They embrace far more than what we often disparagingly refer to as politics, one party fighting another. It's far more than parties jockeying for power. Our civic space is kind of the massive territory of institutions that affect us all, whether they're formally labeled public or private. You are in the public sector. You may be a private organization, but this is part of the American civic space. Well, too many of us neither follow or sufficiently appreciate the impact of the public sector in the civic space. Ignorance is not bliss when it comes to life's political realm. As the celebrated Athenian leader Pericles said, just because you don't take an interest in politics doesn't mean that politics isn't going to take an interest in you. And Pericles knew, because he was a prisoner in Sparta. He was a general in the Sparta-Athenian War. So politics does take an interest in you and all of us. I guess I'm preaching to the choir tonight because you're all pretty political. The more of us who recognize and understand this, the more we can predict how it'll affect us and even nudge it in a good direction. So what's civic literacy? Number one, It's knowledge about our shared community, environment, and civic space. It's the ability to identify and understand what government and citizenship are all about and how they affect us. In broader terms, it's a body of knowledge, skills, and values that constitute our ability to learn the basic rules and tools of participation in a semi-democratic political system such as ours. As an academic study, it's civics or political science, but it's far more than that. It's what we do in our interactions with our churches and our friends and our neighbors. Okay, so where does it come from? Well, it comes from formal education, obviously, but beyond formal education, it comes from family, both nuclear and extended family. It comes from our peers, including social media. It comes from religion. It comes from culture. It comes from media. It comes from the government itself. And it comes from private institutions such as sports and music that affect our public attitudes and take political stands. So what does it require? What do you need to do to be civically literate? A basic understanding of the civic history of the nation. How did we get here? A basic understanding of the institutions and roles as they've evolved in this political system. Yeah, we have 3 branches of government, but how do they really work and who's got the power in them? Understanding of the political thought and values and how those values interact. For example, who here is in favor of liberty? Who's in favor of equality? What happens when liberty and equality are both extended? They conflict and they've got to be reconciled on the playing field of political life. So, it also requires, civic literacy requires a perspective on the relative role of the individual and the political system. What are our individual rights and our individual responsibilities? It requires an understanding of American political institutions in a comparative framework. How do our institutions differ, for example, on our own continent with Mexican institutions and Canadian institutions? And they do, by the way, rather profoundly. Understanding the political economy, that's my wife's specialty, and its structures. What's the Federal Reserve? Who determines our interest rates on our credit cards? All these kinds of things. Understanding how quasi-private institutions can effectively influence public policy. Anybody ever hear of the National Rifle Association, for example? Understanding international geography, politics, and interdependence. How important is it that we have good relationships with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or other organizations? Understanding the tools and consequences of political change. How do we change politics? How should we change politics? What's right and wrong in ways to change politics? It also requires basic logic, facts, and bias recognition, to be media savvy, to know when you're being lied to or being misled. Even by well-meaning people who are probably misled themselves when they write that stuff. Practicing and learning the skills of critical thinking. And finally, following current events and filtering through the knowledge gleaned in all these points. So that's what civic literacy is. How many of us are civically literate? All of us to a degree. How many of us can get better at it? All of us to a degree, including myself. So why does it matter? It's not simply a neutral body of knowledge and skills. It's a body of knowledge that significantly affects how our civil society and government function. It impacts democracy. Democracy depends on informed and active citizens. It's a political structure that depends on both the consent of the government and the active participation of citizens for stability and for legitimacy. If people don't participate and don't agree with the outcomes of democratic decisions, as we've found in the United States, all kinds of bad consequences result from that. So, civic literacy and participation is a moral case as well as a practical case for democratic participation. it's the only form of government that derives its consent of the government, and therefore it's legitimate. As Winston Churchill famously told Parliament in 1947, democracy is the worst system ever invented by man, except for all the others. So there's two major types of democracy. There's direct democracy, as we participate in a referendum or a show of hands or a town meeting. And then there's indirect democracy. In direct democracy, successful popular control policy requires a sufficient number of voters to pay attention. Indirect democracy, or representative government, we don't govern directly, but we select delegates to do. But critically, we have to hold their feet to the fire. We need a mechanism to hold them responsive to our interests and the public opinion. It requires an independent and competent media to tell us what's going on and our participation. If we just say, well, politicians are politicians and they're all crooks and they can all get away with what they're doing, they will. Trust me. It's an invitation. So democracy, American democracy, even though we're only a partially democratic system, is not an exception. Without a critical mass of public-minded citizens with the skills and knowledge to vote intelligently and impact public policy effectively, democracy will wither and die in this country. And guess what? Once it dies, you cannot get it back. And there are several scholars who've written books on how democracies die, and they do. It is not inevitable, because it was written a couple of 100 years ago that this is how our political system was supposed to evolve, that it will continue to evolve that way. There are rather nasty actors out there who want to not only nudge us, but bulldoze us in a different direction. And as far as I'm concerned, if we believe in American democratic principles, it's up to us to resist. Okay, so civic literacy also impacts political stability. It matters for business and entrepreneurs. James Carville, who was a campaign manager for Bill Clinton, said in the 1992 campaign, "It's the economy, stupid," and it is. When it comes to civic literacy, he was right. The economy plays a massive role in our lives. Knowledge of government and the impact of money, taxes, and credit is one of the main components of civil liberty. Corporations exist within a political framework, and what they can do and what they can't do, and the rules of the game for corporations are determined by our political economy. It impacts local government. I have served over the years on a bunch of boards. I was a planning commissioner in Manatee County and on the Tampa Bay Regional Transit Organization and a few other kinds of things. Those are volunteer organizations. Without civic literacy and without people who have a civic commitment, local government is not going to work very well. And a bunch of elites, fat cat developers and their stooges are going to run things. That couldn't happen around here, of course, but no, or Manatee for that matter. It affects nonprofits, philanthropy, and civic organizations. An organization like Veterans for Common Sense could exist within a political framework and the rules of nonprofits. It has a reciprocal relationship to education. Education imparts civic literacy and public policy in the population, and a civically literate population empowers education. And without an educated citizenry, we're doomed. Okay, so what's happened to civic literacy in the United States? Unfortunately, nothing good in the last few years. Recent and reputable studies show that an alarming 21st century decline in American civic literacy. It's declined to the point of crisis. Alarmingly to me, this crisis is not being reversed. The Statistical Center of the U.S. Department of Education, the NCES, is the primary federal entity for collecting and analyzing data. and they have what is known as a National Assessment of Education Progress. You've heard of it. It's called America's Report Card, whether it's on math or other kinds of things. Well, the last nation's report card, released on May 3rd, 2023, the U.S. history and civic scores of 8th graders decreased between 2018 and 2022, and it was no great shakes in 2018. The average score declined by 2 points compared to 2018, and it hasn't risen since 1998. Few 8th graders are reaching high levels of achievement. Only 13% of 8th graders were above what they call the NAP proficient level for knowledge in U.S. history, which means they know they're good students in history. That's the lowest proportion of 8th grade students reaching that level out of any subject assessed by the nation's report card. Only a fifth of students were at the basic level in civics, which is the second lowest proportion of students reaching that level in any subject. So, we're in trouble. 40% of 8th graders performed below the basic level in U.S. history in 2022. Let me repeat that. That's 40% of U.S. 8th graders performed below the basic level of minimal knowledge in U.S. history, compared to 34% in 2018 and 39% in 1994. Scores were lower across all 4 U.S. history themes: democracy, culture, technology, and world role. Fewer students reported taking classes focused on history or civics. We're not teaching it anymore. And when we are teaching it, as we are now mandated to do in Florida, it's not civics, in my opinion. It is propaganda. So, what's even more alarming is this same test was given to state and local office holders, and they performed lower than 8th graders. We're in trouble in terms of civic literacy, and our democracy is in trouble. 71% of Americans fail a basic test of civic literacy with an overall average score of 49%. What percent do they need do immigrants need to become U.S. citizens? 80. We perform at 49, and never mind. I won't go into immigration policy at this point. Fewer than half of all Americans can name all 3 branches of government, a minimal requirement for understanding the U.S. constitutional system. And we found also in studying this intensely that the civic knowledge gained from engaging in frequent conversations about public affairs and reading about current events in history and participating in more involved civic activities is greater than anything we gain from a bachelor's degree. So in fact, our educational system isn't doing too well. Television, including TV news, dumbs America down. The survey revealed, all else remaining equal, a person's test score drops in proportion to the time he or she he or she spends on passive media like television and social media. Okay, the U.S. Bar Association has done similar surveys, and national results were mirrored in the greater Sarasota area as well. According to the Sarasota Herald Tribune, the Manatee County civics achievement fell 5% to 69%, which is still 3% higher than the statewide Florida average. And the district history achievement score fell to 58%, 4 percentage point lower than the state average. Possible causes of the decline. Well, first of all, we're cheap. Inadequate funding of education at all levels in the United States. Schools without adequate funds tend to cut back on non-STEM courses like civics and history first. findings of the U.S. public education spending statistics conclude that, quote, public education spending in the United States falls far short of global benchmarks and lags far behind economic growth, unquote. And according to WLRN, the public radio station in Miami, voucher spending in Florida diverted $1.3 billion last year from public education, or about 10% of Florida's budget, and that number is slated to increase based on recent legislation. And this is happening in some other states as well. Okay, another cause is a lack of a national mandate and testing for quality civics education in accredited public schools. As far as I'm concerned, I don't think you should be able to graduate from any junior high, high school, or college in the United States without demonstrating basic civic literacy. I'm prejudiced. I'm a political science professor, so obviously I have a dog in that fight. But I think it's important. I think that's one of the ways we convey civic knowledge. Another problem is the people who are teaching civics, particularly in the K through 12 public schools, are not teaching it full time and they're not prepared. All too often, they're coaches or other kinds of academic people who are given this in order to fill out a schedule. As far as I'm concerned, anybody teaching such a critical subject at the K-12 level should do it full time and have at least the equivalent of an undergraduate political science or history major and rigorous continuing education requirements, and, I might add, commensurate compensation. Another problem is the polarization of American politics, which has led to a taboo on polite discussion of public policy issues. You're not supposed to talk about politics in your social gatherings. I'm kind of a black sheep because I always bring up politics in our social gatherings. You don't have to do it in a nasty, partisan way. You can ask questions and ask people why they hold that position and so forth. You know, it's like politics, sex, and money. You're not supposed to talk about any of them. I don't care if you talk about sex and money, but you need to talk about politics. I like to talk about sex and money, too. Another problem is the fragmentation of news media that leads to a lack of a common core of understanding. You know, Walter Cronkite's dead. We used to have a kind of nightly news where everybody, whether it was right or wrong, at least we all kind of watched it, or most of us kind of watched it and understood basic facts. Today, basic facts are in dispute. Okay, to reverse this steady slide is not going to be easy. So what can we do? What can we all do? Okay, here is what I consider a citizen agenda for more civic literacy in the United States. Number one, vote intelligently. That is, an informed voter who knows the candidates and issues on the next ballot. There are places where you can easily find that. Vote411.org is a great website, which gives you all kinds of information on candidates and issues and their backgrounds, positions. And there's also great fact-checking sites out there. Politifact.com, formerly part of the Poynter Institute and the St. Pete Times, now the Tampa Bay Times, does a pretty darn good job. So does the Washington Post and the New York Times. And I've been recently getting USA Today fact checks in my mailbox every day, and they seem to be pretty good. So we need to expand the reach and efficacy of fact checking and learn how to recognize signs of intelligent or artificial intelligence manipulation. That's going to be a problem. The farther on we go, artificial intelligence is going to get smarter and smarter as we get dumber and dumber civically. Another thing you can do is ask write an advocacy letter to the editor about pending issues or candidates. Post it on social media, whether it gets published or not. It's a good way to demonstrate your political literacy and subtly encourage others to do so. Volunteer for a local civic project, not necessarily an explicitly political project, such as Friends of the Library, a local public garden, or even a demonstration for or against a local zoning decision. Those are all ways of establishing civic literacy and civic legitimacy. Join a civic group, such as League of Women Voters, which in spite of its name is not just women and has a diverse membership, or service organizations like Kiwanis or Rotary, or projects like this one, or organizations like this one, which is heavily civically involved. Track your personal political economy. Given the fact that economic decisions and policies constitute such a big portion of our institutions' laws and regulation, it's just prudent to know where those are coming from and how you can affect them. Media savviness is really, really important. Good citizens need to learn to be sophisticated news consumers and practice critical thinking. If it doesn't sound right, it probably isn't. Check it out. Go to their sources. Consider the sources. Don't accept questionable claims on face value. And take the internet and social media for what they are. Easy to access sources that don't edit documents, claims, or statements. Anybody can be a publisher on the internet. Some are good, some not so good. Be skeptical. And my advice is never pass along anything controversial that you haven't verified. Okay, so in the end, we need a multi-layered defense against misinformation. I suggest everybody read a daily newspaper of record, such as the Washington Post, the New York Times. Those are good choices. And local news too. And support the paywall. Yeah, I pay the New York Times, and I pay the Washington Post, and I pay the Sarasota Herald Tribune. It's expensive to run a newspaper and to hire reporters and editors and so forth. So with advertising dying out there in print media, I think we ought to support those institutions by paying what they ask, and most of them don't ask very much. Support real civic education in your schools and lobby for it, statewide and nationally. Don't let these turkeys get away with saying, we have civics in this state. Say, show me. Give me proof that we have valid civics. Let's get some people who understand what a civics curriculum ought to look like. Evaluate this. Hillsdale College is not necessarily a model for a valid civic curriculum. You know, we need to be skeptical about what politics and journalists tell us, but we also need to identify and support good politicians and good journalists. Don't be afraid to help them in their campaign. Don't be afraid to write a small check, or a large check for that matter. Believe me, I've run for political office, and I know how much you appreciate that kind of support. Resist anti-democratic policies and politicians by withholding support. Just as you support good ones, don't give a dime or vote for the bad ones. So basically, lobby, write, support lifelong civic literacy, join a civic organization, talk about politics and how important it is with your peers. Halting the decline of civic literacy won't be easy, and even tougher will be reversing the trend and promoting more civic literacy. Nevertheless, even though it's tough, the stakes are great. Without it, we do stand a good chance of losing our democracy and succumbing to authoritarian rule. If we don't nourish a sufficiently large pool of good people who can resist those who are tear our institutions apart, we're sowing the seeds of our own democratic decline. It's kind of like giving your kids a Ferrari and not teaching them how to drive. It's not likely to end very well for the Ferrari or the kids. So we need to incentivize a civically literate electorate. Okay, let me tell you just a little tiny bit about our organization. I want to remind you that our website is savingdemocracyusa.com. I've circulated a couple of papers there. We're starting a newsletter, and I'd appreciate it if you would sign up if you're interested in finding out what we're doing. And we'll send you a monthly newsletter. I promise I won't spam your inbox with daily stuff. And consider joining us as a volunteer in our quest to help American democracy. I'd love to get involved with alliances with organizations such as this, because as we unify and we become bigger groups, we can have a lot more impact. So right now, we're particularly looking for people who have social media skills and people who can get us invited into educational institutions to speak. We want to talk to kids. Public schools, private schools, after-school programs. If you have any contacts there, please let me know and help us. No matter what your skill is, we need your help because together we can make a difference. So, thank you.
Any questions?
Yes. The question is, how do you get the folks who just refuse to look at facts turned around? I guess my answer is you can't. You can't get everybody. If you get the majority of people and you get more than we have now, we're making progress. Some people, I hate to use the word thick-headed, but I will. I just thick-headed and refuse to see facts.
Even congressmen.
Oh, yes, I can name a few of those, who including some from our own state, who meet those criteria. Yes, sir. The question is, if this were a class of high school students, what would you be teaching? What would be my curriculum? On our website is the civics curriculum of the American Political Science Association, the recommended curriculum. But what I would really be doing is what I was talking about before, looking at our government, how it operates comparatively, and how the institutions have truly evolved, not what's written in civics textbooks of 100 years ago. I mean, what's happening right now with the relationship between the executive branch and the judicial branch and our electoral system? That I would be teaching those kinds of things and relating them to our institutions and our Constitution and how it actually works in process. How do we deal with, basically, as I read what you said, how do we deal with the censorship and the suppression of information carefully? There are ways, and even though I was a controversial and sometimes not too calm guy, I managed to get tenures and get promoted from assistant professor to associate and a full professor by just watching my mouth sometimes. And I think that's what we as teachers need to do. Tell the truth, but don't use keywords that will inflame the censors. That's my best advice. Not easy, I know that. Teaching these days is really, really tough. I'm glad I'm retired. Question is, why do we have censorship in democracy?
In the schools.
Because we've elected censors. It is the simple answer. We've allowed people, I won't mention any names, but certain legislators and certain governors to basically adopt curricula that are biased and trying to, I guess the best thing I can call it is projection. The more they say we're against propaganda and leading people in a certain direction through our educational system, the more they're guilty of it. Yeah. You can fill in your own names.
Let's get a big
Okay.
hand.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I have a couple of comments just to follow up on civic literacy. Most of the people in this room and most of the people on Zoom probably know this, but for those of you that don't know it, it's important and very important for our civic literacy. In the Congress, there was one senator that was holding up promotions of service people, the high-ranking officers in the Pentagon, which we need, holding up their careers, holding up their promotions. And Tommy Tuberville, here's how civically literate Tommy Tuberville was from Louisiana, and we have some in Florida not too far behind. When asked when he was campaigning the three branches of government, he couldn't name them. And he has the nerve to hold up the promotions of soldiers and hurting our country. And that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with. Now, I'll give you a little example a little closer to home with some civic literacy that we need to know about. We've got two representatives right here in Manatee and Sarasota County, Stubbe and Buchanan. And both of these guys, they like to talk about how they support veterans. But let me tell you, here's the fact of the matter. They don't support veterans. And the best way you can check that is check the vote on the PACT Act. We have many veterans in our own group, which we know, and one just died. He's going to have a funeral this week, a Vietnam vet, because of the toxic exposures he had in Vietnam. The PACT Act helps deal with that problem and helps veterans that have been hurt. And guess who voted against that? Both of those guys. And how many of our veteran friends know that? Yeah, we do in this room, but our veterans friends outside this room, they still think that they support veterans because they say they do. It's our obligation to start educating our fellow citizens and our fellow veterans and let them know that this MAGA movement is not for us, it's not for helping veterans, it's not for helping the citizens, it's mostly for helping big corporations and big money. One of the objectives of our group, as everybody knows in here, is combating climate change. Well, it's hard to combat climate change when you have a governor that gets $10 million in campaign funds from the power companies. Right now, Florida could transition to an electric power system where electricity would be practically free. And we could do that in 5 or 10 years. But we can't do it in Florida. You know why? The power companies and the governor won't let us. So that's how politics comes down where the rubber meets the road. And our fellow citizens need to realize it. We need to be more civically literate because what they're doing to us is hurting us. That hurts us when we have to pay an electricity bill that's not necessary. And to get off my high horse, I want to encourage everybody to come to our Tom Paine party every year. And our Tom Paine party is coming up this year on February the 29th, and it's going to be a lot of fun. We always, as part of our civic literacy, we stand firmly in the tradition of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is what I call the unknown founder. He gave us the name United States. He was the one that said, we've got to get rid of this king. We don't need somebody telling us what to do. We can decide for ourselves and have a government. And the revolutionaries, they agreed, and that's why we have the United States of America. He was also the first abolitionist, the first one to write about slavery and how awful it was. And he was the first one to give us the idea of Social Security. And what high school student knows the name Thomas Paine? I talk to people all the time, and I say, do you know who Thomas Paine is? Who is that? So we've got a lot of work to do. We really commend Jeff for the good work that your group is doing, and for certain we're going to be working with you. And so come to the Tom Paine party, support our group. We've got lots to do. John, back in the back, is writing an article right now about the MAGA leader being possibly taken off the ballot by the Supreme Court. And so we're trying to do our part as a group. So join with us, give us more support, and we'll get the job done. We've got to turn out MAGA come November. And if we sit back, we're not going to be able to do it. So let's get busy, and unless there's any further comments, meeting adjourned.